still doing that now. Well, we've seen all week long him handing over more pieces. We got confirmation today that the grand jury that he's convened in D.C. is robustly continuing its work under new prosecutors. So that means more to come.
Much more to come.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Rachel. We are finally getting much closer to a very important number, something that the House Judiciary Chairman said today. It's a number we've been talking about on this show for a while. But before we get to that, we have to do a little bit of full disclosure here, because in the second half, the back half of this show, you're going to see two people I know, two people who are friends of mine, one Democrat, one Republican. I've worked with both of them. Tom Malinowski, who's now a Democratic congressman from New Jersey. I worked in Senator Moynihan's office. Tom has spent a career concerned with human rights, most recently as a State Department Assistant Secretary of State in the Obama administration. He got his first chance today, his very first chance, in the House Foreign Affairs Committee to question Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. And he wanted to know what's to like about the murderous dictator of South Korea. That's how we're going to end this hour tonight. We're going to get to that at the end of this hour. You're going to want to see Tom Malinowski's questioning of Mike Pompeo. And before that, we're going to hear from Stuart Stevens, who is now working full time with the one Republican who is actually seriously exploring a primary threat, Republican primary threat to President Trump. And Stuart Stevens was the top strategist in Mitt Romney's quest for the Republican nomination and then his campaign in 2012. Stuart Stevens has worked on more Republican campaigns possibly than he can remember at this point. So this is a very serious Republican player who's going to give us a real insight about what the real possibilities are, what the impacts could be from a challenge to a sitting Republican president in presidential primaries. The last time we saw that, the Republican president did not win his reelection. It was when Pat Buchanan challenged George H.W. Bush in Republican primaries. President Bush got the nomination. Buchanan didn't get the nomination. But President Bush could not hold on to the White House after that challenge. We're going to hear from Stuart Stevens about, is this a year where we could see something like that happen again? But to begin, we are finally getting closer to a very important number, and it's a big one. It's so big that it makes perfect sense why this number would have been deliberately excluded from the Attorney General Barr's letter about the Mueller report if, and I'm only saying if here, if the Attorney General's letter was actually trying to make the Mueller report seem as favorable to the president as possible. If that's what the Attorney General was trying to do, and we don't know if he was, but if that's what the Attorney General was trying to do in that letter, one thing he wasn't going to mention is how long the Mueller report actually is, how many pages. Most of the news media seem to treat the Attorney General's 4-page letter about the Mueller report to actually be the Mueller report, which, of course, no one in the news media has actually seen. So what if, on the first page of the Attorney General's 4-page letter, instead of writing, this report is entitled Report on the Investigation into Russian Interference in the 2016 Presidential Election, what if instead of that, the Attorney General wrote, this 900-page report is entitled Report on the Investigation into the Russian Interference Investigation of the 2016 Presidential Election? 900 pages would have staggered the news media. 700 pages would have staggered the news media. 500 pages would have staggered the news media. 500 pages would have humbled the news media into instantly realizing that a 4-page letter that they were holding was not a 500-page Mueller report. But the page count was not included in the Attorney General's letter describing the Mueller report, and Ari Melber was the first to raise this in his superb coverage of the Attorney General's letter on Sunday night, and we discussed it here on this program for the last 2 nights briefly. And finally today, we are moving closer to an answer because the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, Jerry Nadler, agrees with Ari Melber that it is an important question. So important, it is one of the things that he discussed today with Attorney General William Barr in what Chairman Nadler said was a 10-minute phone call. This is what the Chairman Nadler told reporters about that phone call this afternoon.
I had a phone call with the Attorney General, and I asked him about the length and breadth of the Mueller report. He told me it was a very substantial report, one that, in my judgment, a 4-page summary cannot begin to do justice to.
How many pages is the report? When you say very substantial, do you mean hundreds of pages? How many pages?
I can't say that, but it's very substantial.
And you know how many pages it is?
Yes,
Fox News is
it's
saying
very substantial.
700.
What?
Fox News is saying 700. Is that accurate?
More than that?
I
Less than
can't
that?
comment
More?
today.
Very substantial, less than 1,000.
Oh, I would think so.
First thing he said, very first thing he said, I asked him about the length. I asked him about the length and breadth of the Mueller report. And so now we know. It's less than 1,000 pages. That means it could be the longest special prosecutor's report in history. If Fox News is right and it's 700 pages, that would make it the longest special prosecutor's report in history. Kenneth Starr's report on President Clinton that led to the impeachment of President Clinton in the House of Representatives was 445 pages, all of which was released to the Congress and the public. We don't know how many pages of the Mueller report describe and analyze Lester Holt's interview with President Trump after the president fired FBI Director James Comey. But in an exclusive interview with Lester Holt today, James Comey said he is eager to see that and everything else that's in the full Mueller report.
I don't know what the special counsel found, and I'm prepared, I hope everybody is, to wait and get the transparency that we need.
Do you ask yourself why Mueller did not subpoena President Trump to try to get to the heart of this intent question on obstruction?
Yes, I do. And I don't know the answer to that. I have the same question about how the Attorney General could resolve the question, which he says in his letter turns upon the president's intent without the president having been asked what his intent is.
The clearest picture we have of the president's intent actually came in Lester Holt's interview immediately after the president fired James Comey.
In fact, when I decided to just do it, I said to myself, I said, you know, this Russia thing with Trump and Russia is a made-up story.
What did you think when you heard that?
I thought that's potentially obstruction of justice, and I hope somebody is going to look at that. Again, the president appears to be saying, I don't know what's in his head, which is why I can't reach the conclusion. What he appears to be saying is, I got rid of this guy to shut down an investigation that threatened me.
Now, remember, James Comey is a former U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York. He's a former deputy attorney general of the United States who, in effect, served as acting attorney general when Attorney General John Ashcroft was hospitalized. James Comey was the director of the FBI, appointed by President Obama. Most of his service has been in a Republican-run Justice Department, and even James Comey, with all that experience, is mystified, as the rest of us are, about why Robert Mueller did not reach a conclusion on the obstruction of justice investigation of the president.
The purpose of a special counsel is to make sure that the politicals, in this case the Attorney General, doesn't make the ultimate call on whether the subject of the investigation, the President of the United States, should be held criminally liable for activities that were under investigation. And so the idea that a special counsel wouldn't reach the question and hand it to the political leadership doesn't make sense. I'm not prejudging it. I'm just saying it doesn't make sense on its face. I don't know why he didn't here, and I don't know what combination of law and fact led him to that, which is why I'm going to wait and hear the explanation, which I hope will come.
To President Trump and his supporters who claim there never should have been an investigation, James Comey said this.
I don't know what people are thinking saying we shouldn't have investigated, right? Remember where this started. In late July of the election year, we knew the Russians were engaged in a massive effort to hurt Hillary Clinton and help Donald Trump. And then we learned that a Trump campaign advisor had spoken to a Russian operative about the dirt they had on Hillary Clinton before any of us knew anything about it. How on earth would the FBI leave that alone?
Leading off our discussion now, member of Congress on one of the committees leading the current effort to get the Mueller report. Democratic Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, who has represented Washington, D.C. in the Congress since 1991. Eleanor Holmes Norton has seen it all. That's why we need her here tonight. She serves on the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee. Also joining us, David Criss, former Assistant Attorney General for National Security under President Obama. He also served as the Associate Deputy Attorney General for National Security Issues under President Bush. We're going to discuss with him the national security issues that have not yet been resolved and might or might not be by the Mueller report. And we're lucky to have Jon Meacham with us tonight, a presidential historian and an MSNBC contributor. And Jon Meacham has more historical perspective on these issues than I could summon if you gave me all night. I want to start with you, Congresswoman, and get your reaction, first of all, to Chairman Nadler's description of his conversation with the Attorney General. He was very circumspect in what he was willing to reveal about it. He clearly got either a very specific page count from the Attorney General or something close to what it is, but he didn't want to share that publicly at this stage. And it seems like what's coming your way, should you get your hands on the whole thing, may very well be the longest special prosecutor's report in history.
Which is only part of the reason we must have it, because even if we had the whole thing, we probably have to do our own executive summary. And, you know, we're used to getting executive summaries in Congress, but they always give us the whole thing right along with it. There's no way to avoid giving this document to the Congress. When is the last time you have seen such bipartisanship? The Republicans say we ought to have it. The Democrats say we ought to have it. There's no way we're not going to get it.
And Jon Meacham, the precedent here is very clear. There was no hesitation really for Ken Starr handing over the whole thing directly to Congress. Of course, he was operating under different laws, different controls than this new version of the special prosecutor. But precedent here is basically full disclosure at this stage.
Absolutely. Iran-Contra, Judge Walsh's report. I can't think of a precedent where these have been held back in any way. I think it's absolutely essential that, except for the obvious redactions for national security, we see it as soon as possible. And then reason has to take a stand against passion in the arena. And I think if, in fact, what has been reported, if what the Attorney General wrote is the best that Director Mueller could do, and there was no collusion here, there was no evidence of it, and not sufficient evidence or of obstruction, then reason for those who are unhappy with the incumbent president suggests that it's time to focus on moving forward and trying to take care of this in the 2020 election. It also means that the folks on the right, as you just alluded to, who spent the last 2 years saying that Mueller was the Fortinbras of the deep state, this enemy of Trump who'd been pushed forward to do in the president, and now he's become the savior of the republic to Fox News folks who weren't particularly thrilled with him 96 hours ago. I think they, too, have to acknowledge that, as Director Comey just said, the investigation was essential. The conversation that we're having is essential. What Congresswoman Norton and her colleagues will be looking at and going forward is essential. But what I think we need more than anything else right now is at least a nod at letting the facts lead our political discussion. The President of the United States doesn't want us to do that. The President has helped create a climate where ideology trumps a reasonable reaction to data. And I think that process of reformation, if you will, has to begin with us.
And David Criss, I want to go to a point that's been raised by Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff. He's been speaking today in one interview about the need to determine what is happening with the counterintelligence investigation that was begun, actually even before the special prosecutor was named, a counterintelligence investigation on Russian interference with the election, because that could operate on a separate track and a continuing track past the end point of the Mueller investigation. Could you explain how that works?
Sure. The FBI has long had open a counterintelligence investigation into Russian election interference. And frankly, I have no doubt whatsoever that that investigation continues because Russian efforts to influence our future elections have obviously not stopped. So there is this underlying and ongoing need to defend against these foreign threats to our national security, to the integrity of our elections. We've got a good understanding of what the Russians did in 2016. I think we have some understanding of what they tried to do in the midterm elections in 2018. And I know that our intelligence community is on guard and continuing to do good work to try to figure out what they intend for the next election and to try to put a stop to it.
Congresswoman Norton, if you look at Trump approval ratings, it appears as though the general public believes nothing happened on Sunday night when the Barr letter was made public. There's a Politico approval poll coming out that says before the Barr letter was released, President Trump had a 41% approval rating, 54% disapproval. After the Barr letter was released, those numbers are statistically the same, a movement tightly within the margin of error. 42% approve, 55% disapprove. So the disapproval actually went up 1 point and the approval went up 1 point. Pollsters would tell you there was no movement there. So, Congressman Norton, it seems the public recognizes that actually nothing happened on Sunday night and they're waiting for the Mueller report.
They certainly are waiting. When you put out a 4-page summary that essentially clears the president of obstruction, clears him of collusion, with no underlying word as to why, the public opinion is not going to move. And it's not going to move one way or the other until someone can explain this report. You can't explain a report you don't have. Even when we get the report, I will not be satisfied. I want Mr. Mueller and Mr. Barr before our committee so we can talk to them. Look, you can't cross-examine a report. You can't cross-examine a summary of a report. I need to talk to the real deal, these two men. But at the very least, we want the full report out. And you're very right. If we get the report out, suppose it is 1,000 pages. It's going to take you and the press and a lot of staff to make members of Congress and the public understand what is the core of that. I don't suggest that if we had the whole thing, we'd know how to talk about it today. So imagine taking, if it was a 1,000-page report, and boiling it down as Mr. Barr did, and expecting that anybody in the public would believe that that's all we need to know, or that's all there is to it.
David Crist, let me take you back to this point about the counterintelligence investigation and clarify for us that there are different objectives between, say, a Mueller investigation and a counterintelligence investigation. Counterintelligence investigation, for example, might or might not be targeted at trying to uncover crimes and issue indictments, or as I understand it, it might just kind of continue indefinitely in order to pick up information necessary to mount a defense against whatever that intelligence invasion is.
Well, that's exactly right. A criminal investigation is focused on whether somebody violated the criminal law. And prosecutors don't return indictments unless they have enough evidence to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. So the first thing is there's a lot of daylight between that standard and a finding that there's no evidence of guilt. And I think there's been some confusion on that. The Mueller report, as quoted by Barr, said the evidence doesn't establish a conspiracy, but we don't know what it shows with respect to a conspiracy, short of establishing it by proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And the counterintelligence investigation has a much wider scope and focus. It is focused on the threat posed by Russian election interference, and it would embrace criminal conduct, but also conduct that isn't criminal but is still bad, that puts our country in danger. So even if there's not a criminal conspiracy or agreement between the Trump campaign and the Russian government, the counterintelligence investigation might address things like, well, did the Trump campaign, follow best practices in dealing with these offers of dirt and other things from the Russian government? Or are there some things we can learn here and maybe do better the next time around, because we obviously need to do better.
We have to squeeze in a break here. Congressman Eleanor Holmes Norton and David Crist, thank you both for joining us. John Meacham, please stay with us. And when we come back, you first met Tasha Nelson on this program when she was fighting to protect her 7-year-old son, Jack, by fighting to save the protections of the Affordable Care Act that have benefited her and her family so much. And now, thanks to President Trump's new legal move against the Affordable Care Act, she is back at it. She will join us once again. And in tonight's last word, the freshman Democrats have done it again. Today was Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's turn to be questioned by the freshman Democrats, and he really didn't have the answers when asked what's to like about a murderous dictator in North Korea.
Hi, it's Katie Tur. Want to keep up with MSNBC while you're on the go? Subscribe to the MSNBC Daily Newsletter. You'll get the best of what you've missed during this unprecedented era of news. Text MSNBC to 66866 to subscribe.
John Meacham is going to be back with us in a later segment because John delivered a moving eulogy for Barbara Bush at her funeral. And there is a new book coming out revealing just how anti-Trump Barbara Bush was, which means Barbara Bush might be the next deceased subject of a Twitter attack by the President of the United States. We'll get John Meacham's reaction to that possibility later in this hour. But today in the House of Representatives, the top Republican in the House is reportedly disagreeing with President Trump's decision to try to destroy the Affordable Care Act in the courts. Axios reports House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy told Trump over the phone that the decision made no sense, especially after Democrats killed Republicans in the midterms, in part over the issue of pre-existing conditions, according to two sources familiar with their recent conversation. NBC News reports that sources familiar with White House discussions say 4 members of the president's administration expressed concerns about the move to the president. Attorney General William Barr, Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar, White House counsel Pat Cipollone, and Vice President Mike Pence. The New York Times reported there was a heated meeting in the Oval Office on Monday where acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney convinced the president to move forward with trying to kill the Affordable Care Act. The Times says that Vice President Mike Pence was concerned about the political ramifications of moving ahead without a strategy or a plan to handle the suddenly uninsured if the suit succeeds. 21 million people could lose health insurance if the Affordable Care Act is struck down. The White House officials admit to NBC News that they currently have no plan to replace Obamacare, something the world already knows. But Donald Trump said today, quote, if the Supreme Court rules that Obamacare is out, we will have a plan that is far better than Obamacare. Joining our discussion now is someone who depends on the Affordable Care Act because her son has what health insurance calls a pre-existing condition. Tasha Nelson has a 7-year-old son named Jack who has cystic fibrosis. And Tasha, thank you very much for joining us tonight. I know you are both an expert on the politics of this and an expert on the real life of this. And I hate to rush into politics discussions when real lives are involved. Tell us what this would mean to you if on a certain day in the future, the Supreme Court struck down the Affordable Care Act in its entirety. And as of that day, there was no Affordable Care Act.
I advocate with the Little Lobbyists. We are a group of parents and caregivers who advocate with our medically complex and disabled children in Capitol Hill to tell our stories. And the number one thing that we all benefit from in the Affordable Care Act is the protection for pre-existing conditions, because our children all have pre-existing conditions. When it comes to medical complexity, that comes at a cost. I received a box at my home yesterday that's my son Jack's monthly meds. The price tag on that box is $9,000, $108,000 a year. Without protection for pre-existing conditions, how will I come up with the money to keep my son alive? The medications in that box keep his organs functioning, his lungs breathing.
And what do you see as the possibilities here if the Supreme Court does this? The Democrats are not in a position, having only control of the House of Representatives. There couldn't be any kind of quick legislative remedy at all. We know that. The Republicans have proved they can't legislate anything.
No, the fact is, healthcare should not be a partisan issue. It's the one thing that unites us all in this country. Every single American needs access to high-quality, affordable health care. Everybody is one day away from a diagnosis that could change their life, be it cancer, a car accident where they're injured, or a baby born with a pre-existing condition. These are real-life realities that can happen in the flick of the eye. Both sides of the aisle need to be involved. And the truth is, the side that protects the people the most is the side that's going to win, as was evidenced in the 2018 elections.
And Tasha, it seems that in the inside reports in the White House, if they are true, at least Mike Pence, or we should say perhaps even Mike Pence, understands what would happen to you if on a day in the future the Supreme Court just ruled the Affordable Care Act unconstitutional in its entirety and knocked it out. It was Mike Pence who was saying, what would happen to people with pre-existing conditions? We don't have anything in place. We don't have anything ready that could possibly deal with that.
Families like mine, we can't bank on the hope that something might come that will protect us later. We need it in black and white, in ink. We need the legislation to say and exist that says this is exactly how we will protect you, because our lives are on the line. A cold or a flu could take out my son. I know what fear is. What this administration has done to me and my community this week is terrorized us. We are terrified.
Tasha, how is Jack doing now?
He was in Baltimore all day today. He saw ENT, hematology, pulmonology, respiratory therapy, nutrition. He had a bunch of tests done. For the last couple of weeks, his lung function has been declining as a result of having the flu recently. And he's been to Baltimore from Northern Virginia 3 times in the last week because that's where his care center is.
Tasha, we're very glad to have you back. We wish this stress wasn't coming your way once again, and our best hopes for Jack.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, we now have a challenger, one challenger, exploring a Republican presidential campaign against President Trump in the Republican primaries, and a top Republican strategist has joined that exploration. That top Republican strategist will join us next. And tonight, Twitter awaits another hate storm from the President of the United States aimed at another now deceased Republican icon. Just before her death, Barbara Bush sat for a series of interviews with veteran journalist and USA Today's Washington bureau chief Susan Page. Those interviews are the basis for Susan Page's new book, The Matriarch. According to an excerpt of the book released today, Barbara Bush kept a Trump countdown clock, counting down to his last day in office, that sat on her bedside table. Barbara Bush was so disheartened by the way her party had embraced Trump that by February of 2018, she no longer considered herself a Republican. We'll ask John Meacham about that in a moment. John knew Barbara Bush very well and delivered an eloquent eulogy for her at her funeral. Barbara Bush would no doubt be encouraged by former Massachusetts Republican Governor William Weld, who is at the exploratory stage of a Republican primary challenge to President Trump. Stuart Stevens, the top strategist for Mitt Romney's 2012 presidential campaign, has now joined Bill Weld's exploration full-time. Stuart Stevens has worked on Republican campaigns, including several presidential campaigns, for most of his adult life. He is also the author of several nonfiction books and novels. And we worked together on a short-lived television drama where Stuart Stevens was the most colorful character in the writer's room. He is very much a political realist, and so we want to hear from him tonight in realistic terms. What are the real possibilities of a Republican primary challenge to Donald Trump? Stuart Stevens and Jon Meacham will join us next. Here is former Republican Massachusetts Governor William Weld announcing his exploration of a candidacy to challenge Donald Trump in the Republican presidential primaries.
They say the president has captured the Republican Party in Washington. As he himself might tweet, sad. It's even sadder that Republicans in Washington, many of them, exhibit all the symptoms of Stockholm Syndrome, identifying with their captor.
Joining our discussion now, Stuart Stevens, a Republican political consultant who served as the chief strategist for Mitt Romney's 2012 presidential campaign. He's now a political advisor to William Weld. And Jon Meacham is back with us to mount what might be a peremptory defense of Barbara Bush against a tweet storm from President Trump. Jon, let me just start with you on Barbara Bush and what we just discussed in the last block. So Susan Page's book is going to come out. It's going to apparently be filled with what Barbara Bush doesn't like about Donald Trump. We've seen what President Trump continues to do to John McCain. What are you expecting from the president, and what do you know about Barbara Bush's feelings about Donald Trump since you knew her so well?
Well, I would just, you said some kind words about the eulogy I was honored to give. I'll tell you quickly, I've always, like you, I suspect, you've gone to funerals and you've left thinking, boy, I wish the person we were talking about had just heard that. And so I asked her if she wanted to hear the eulogy. And she said, no, but I'll be listening. So I'm saying everything I'm about to say with that in mind. She, as her husband once, I remember hearing him say once, after she had been holding forth on various subjects, Bar, how do you have so many damn opinions about everything? This is Barbara Bush unfiltered, which is redundant. All right. Mrs. Bush was one of the last great truth tellers in American politics, and it got her in trouble. Remember, 1984, she referred to a female opponent of her husband's as a word that rhymed with rich, and the family came after her, and everybody came after her, and she realized that, as she said, I'm not the poet laureate. I should watch myself. I think that if I were Donald Trump, I would pick a fight with somebody my own size, and Barbara Bush is way too big for him.
Stuart Stevens, it strikes me as I listen to Jon that there's some real family similarities between Bill Weld, the Weld family, and the Bush family, the old line New England WASP style Republican, stylistically very similar people. But you're now fully engaged in trying to help Bill Weld move toward possibly a campaign for the Republican presidential nomination. We think of the challenges we've seen in the past in these situations. The very first one that I think we all saw was 1968 with Gene McCarthy. McCarthy didn't win the nomination, but the president he challenged didn't win the nomination or the presidency either. We saw that happen with Pat Buchanan challenging George H.W. Bush. George H.W. Bush won the nomination, but after that challenge, he couldn't win the presidency. Is that dynamic possible here with Bill Weld?
Same with Jimmy Carter when he ran. Ted Kennedy when he ran against Jimmy Carter. I think it's very possible. Bill Weld, when he ran for governor in 1990, was a super long shot. I worked for him then. We couldn't get enough votes at the Republican State Convention to get on the ballot. We had to get petitions. And he won that, and he became the first Republican governor elected in 20 years in Massachusetts. So he's not afraid of big challenges. He's beaten the odds before. He got reelected with historic numbers, 71%. He's really the perfect alternative if he decides to run to Donald Trump. I mean, as U.S. attorney, he won 110 out of 111 2011 corruption cases. He broke up Kevin White's machine, which you remember well, Lawrence, in Boston. Running against a president who's campaign manager, a deputy campaign manager, national security advisor, foreign policy advisor, are all now felons. I mean, that's just a perfect contrast for somebody who could go in and clean up what is clearly a mess. He balanced a budget. That's something Republicans seem to have completely forgotten about. So he'll definitely be a strong voice to give people a real alternative if they have a different vision of the country and the party.
And Stuart, talk about him as a campaigner, because I believe you worked on at least one of his Massachusetts governor's campaigns.
I did. I worked on actually both of them in 90 and 94.
Yeah. Talk about his ability to roll with what becomes the Trump experience in a Republican primary.
Well, you know, he's very quick. He doesn't take things personally. In a debate with John Silber, he accused him of coming over in the Mayflower, and he famously said, "No, my family didn't come over in the Mayflower. We sent the servants over with the Silver." And everybody fell down laughing, and that was the end of that. He's a big guy in all senses of the word. He has a big heart and a big soul. He sort of embraces this. So I think that he'll really enjoy, if he decides to running in New Hampshire. And there's this weird thing in New Hampshire that the person that seems to enjoy it the most seems to do very, very well in New Hampshire. I learned that lesson when John McCain was running against George Bush, and I was working for George Bush. They were having a lot more fun in the McCain campaign.
And John Meacham, Bill Weld is a tall guy. He's that big guy. He takes the same space that Trump takes up. And as Stuart just mentioned, he obviously has a sense of humor. He had to. He survived Boston politics. He was running against that Boston Democratic machine all the time, and they were trying to push him around. And I have to say, I observed from them that they developed a real respect for a grudging respect, I should call it, a grudging respect for his ability to beat them.
You're exactly right. He's a happy warrior.
Yeah.
I'm an admirer of Governor Weld in that sense. And he's a TR Republican, right? I mean, which is vanishingly rare breed now. I think he's perfect for this. And I think he'll have fun. And I think he'll, as Stuart says, I think he'll communicate that he's having fun. I remember him saying back probably 20 years ago now, when we were in the middle of some moment where we wanted an independent to come in and save us from the pettiness of politics. And he said, everyone denounces the pettiness of politics. I love the pettiness of politics. So he's perfect.
Yeah, and Stuart, as we know, there's a few things more dangerous than a smart politician who has nothing to lose, and that would be Bill Weld in this campaign. Stuart Stevens, John Meacham, thank you both very much for joining us tonight. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you. And when we come back, the House Democratic freshman did it again today. Today it was Congressman Tom Malinowski's turn. I introduced you to Tom Malinowski on this program weeks ago. You're going to want to see what he did with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in a hearing this afternoon. Those freshmen have done it again. Members of the House of Representatives only get 5 minutes to question witnesses in hearings, and the freshman Democrats in the House, as we have shown you repeatedly on this program, are making the most of their 5 minutes and confronting witnesses in many ways that we have never seen before in congressional hearings. Today, it was Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's turn to learn what it's like to go up against the freshman Democrats. This time, he was facing one of the most experienced of the freshman Democrats, a veteran of the Obama State Department, Congressman Tom Malinowski of New Jersey. And Tom Malinowski has been deeply outraged every time President Trump has said this about the murderous communist dictator of North Korea.
He likes me, I like him. Some people say, oh, you shouldn't like him. I said, why shouldn't I like him?
What's to like? That was Tom Malinowski's question today for Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. What's to like about the dictator who has murdered countless numbers of his own people and held Otto Warmbier in custody and tortured him before sending him home to die? What's to like? We'll show you Mike Pompeo's failure to answer that question after this break. Full disclosure, freshman Democratic Congressman from New Jersey, Tom Malinowski, and I both served on the staff of Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan before Tom went on to serve in the Clinton administration and most recently in the Obama State Department as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. In the House Foreign Affairs Committee today, Tom Malinowski had a chance to question Donald Trump's Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo.
If we're going to be so forceful in denouncing socialism, why is the administration so high on communism?
Yeah, I mean, the very statement there is pretty outrageous.
Well, I'm talking about North Korea, sir. The most perfectly realized communist state in history, a country where the state owns everything and everyone, and yet the administration is repeatedly referring to how it has, quote, awesome economic potential, how it can become an economic powerhouse, quote unquote, without changing its system, simply by giving up nuclear weapons.
Congressman Malinowski was just getting warmed up.
I'm asking because there's a whole lot of rhetoric about liking Kim Jong-un, falling in love with Kim Jong-un being our friend. And so let me ask you, why is liking Kim Jong-un a sufficient reason to cancel or not to pursue sanctions against companies helping his nuclear program, as the White House said last week? I'm quoting the White House there.
There have been more sanctions put in place by this administration with a global coalition than at any time in the world's history, sir.
And yet liking him is cited as a reason not to do more.
Last week, President Trump tweeted that he was going to undo some sanctions on North Korea. The White House press secretary then issued a statement saying President Trump likes Chairman Kim, and he doesn't think these sanctions will be necessary.
Is Kim Jong-un responsible for maintaining North Korea's system of labor camps?
He's the leader of the country.
Is he responsible for ordering the execution of his uncle, the assassination by chemical agent of his half-brother?
He's the leader of the country.
Was he responsible for the decision not to allow Otto Warmbier to come home until he was on death's door?
I'll leave the president's statement to stand. He made that statement. We all know that the North Korean regime was responsible for the tragedy that occurred to Otto Warmbier. I've met that family. I know those people. I love them dearly.
So
They suffered mightily, sir.
So what's to like?
They suffered mightily, sir.
So what's to like about Kim
Sir,
Jong-un?
don't make this a political football. It's inappropriate. It's inappropriate to do.
Well, when the White House says that sanctions decisions are based on liking Kim Jong-un,